Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today I'm talking with William Anthony Hay about his new book, Lord Liverpool, A Political Life. William Anthony Hay is an associate professor of history at Mississippi State University. He's a frequent contributor to various political publications, and he is also working on a book on the British side of the American Revolution. Will Hay, glad to have you on the program.
Well, thank you so much.
So this book, Lord Liverpool, A Political Life, who was Lord Liverpool? Why do we need to understand him? Does he have interesting lessons for American conservatives today?
Well, he does. He was Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool was Prime Minister for 15 years, which is an uninterrupted tenure as Prime Minister that no successor has yet matched. He was Prime Minister during a pivotal era. His career encompasses the age of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that followed, and also the transition after that conflict. It's the pivotal era of the Industrial Revolution. Paul Johnson has described the period from 1815 to 1830 as the birth of the modern, when an awful lot of cultural, political, and social trends emerged out of the aftermath of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And Liverpool's the man whose life runs through that. He held all the big offices in the British government. He was Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary. He was the Secretary of War during the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars, and was Wellington's partner during the long struggle in the Peninsula. So Liverpool also, by the way, was leader of the House of Lords, defending government policy and managing debates and legislation for the years before he became Prime Minister. So he came to that office with an awful lot of experience, even though he was one of the youngest men to be Prime Minister.
So you mentioned Lord Liverpool and foreign policy, the Peninsular Wars. Yeah. How did he see British engagement in Europe? And I know he was, and you write about this extensively, promoted, helped form and keep together sort of a grand coalition of countries against Napoleon's, expansive wars across the continent. But when those wars ended, when Napoleon was brought to heel and exiled, he also pulled back and did not see sort of an ongoing need for Britain to be involved in various, political goings on in Europe. So maybe talk about that.
Well, on a certain level, Liverpool was a Euroskeptic, and it brings to mind John Maynard Keynes.
When you say he was a Euroskeptic, what did that mean? What did that mean in the early 19th century?
That's a good question to raise. Of course, the European Union did not exist until the 1990s. Its precursor, the European Economic Community, did not exist until after the Second World War. Eurosceptic in Liverpool's day meant caution about too deep an involvement in continental European politics. Liverpool shared a view with other British statesmen, including his mentor and predecessor, William Pitt the Younger. He shared the view that Britain had a strong interest in a European balance of power. If any single country in Europe became dominant, and during this era, over the long 18th century, it was really going to be France that would pose the threat. If one country became dominant, then that country could invade Britain or could put the continent behind an attack on British interests. So British statesmen, really from this, even as early as the 16th and the 17th century, were leery of any rival becoming dominant. But that being said, there are limits to what Britain could do and how far Britain could intervene to prevent or to manage European affairs. So Liverpool's view was to pursue a balance and promote a balance of power on the continent to ensure an environment in Europe that favored British interests and protected British security, but he wasn't willing to get too much into the weeds of European politics. And a lot of that is because he saw European countries as having different interests from Britain. European countries had a different political culture where public opinion did not play the same role. Britain had a constitutional government, a monarchy that was limited under law in many ways and responsible to Parliament. Really, sovereignty rested with not the king himself or the king as a person, even the crown alone as an institution, but rather the crown and Parliament, which represented the estates of the realm. And that made Britain different from other European powers. And another thing that I would add to that, as far as the difference goes, is that, and this is not a point that Liverpool himself made, but Britain and Russia were peripheral powers in Europe, both of which had security from being on the edges of Europe, Russia in the east, Britain in the west on the Atlantic. And both of those countries also looked in a different direction. Russia to the east in Asia, Britain looked out to the Atlantic and the Atlantic world. And that view and those wider interests, that shaped a lot of British thinking. It shaped Liverpool's thinking. He saw that Britain had security from the ups and downs of continental politics more than other great powers in Europe. But also Britain had maritime and overseas interests more than other great powers that required a balancing. So Liverpool's Euroscepticism was a pragmatic view of how best to pursue a relationship with European powers. Europe was not a single entity, but how best to pursue relationships in Europe to serve British interests.
So thinking about, let me ask you this question. Thinking about Lord Liverpool looking across the Atlantic to the young United States, he becomes prime minister in 1812. So how does he? So we've got this European situation going on, Napoleon and all that. But we've also got the War of 1812 and that. So how does he juggle these?
Liverpool had a very expansive geopolitical view. Part of that is understanding the importance of trade and commerce. Also, Liverpool understood India and the United States, the role of North America in British calculations and in British interests. So Liverpool's map, so to speak, was not simply the map of Europe and the Mediterranean. It's also a map that reached to the Indian Ocean, and it's certainly a map that paid a lot of attention to the United States by including the Atlantic. You mentioned Liverpool as prime minister. One of the things Liverpool did early on, and it didn't work, was an attempt to remove some of the causes of friction with the United States. Liverpool didn't want the War of 1812. Liverpool was not sympathetic to the United States, nor was he overwhelmingly hostile. He saw the United States as increasingly a rival with potential commercial and potential maritime power. And when he became prime minister, one of the things that he did was he had the government drop some commercial policies known as the Orders in Council. These were essentially measures of economic warfare against Napoleonic France that had drawn the United States into a quarrel with Britain. They'd also aroused domestic opposition among merchants and manufacturers in Britain. And so Liverpool was trying to essentially get rid of the domestic opposition and remove a point of friction with the United States so Britain could focus on this existential war against Napoleon's France.
Thinking about that war. So how does Lord Liverpool manage Napoleon? Does he mobilize Britain? So you say existential interest. Does he mobilize Britain in sort of a comprehensive way to deal with that threat, or does he do something else?
Well, let me say something about Liverpool's view of Napoleon. Liverpool had been a foreign secretary in a brief government under Henry Addington, and Liverpool was the man who negotiated with Napoleon's regime. Napoleon was then first consul of France. He negotiated the Peace of Amiens, which was an attempt to a failed attempt because the peace didn't last, to achieve a settlement with Napoleonic France. essentially at the end of the 1790s, Liverpool thought that Napoleon's rise to power in France would give Britain someone with whom Britain could negotiate and with whom other European powers could negotiate. Liverpool thought that Napoleon would have a role a little bit like General George Monk in Britain at the end of the Cromwellian era after the English Civil Wars. Monk was the man who managed the restoration of Charles II. And so Liverpool thought maybe this general who's risen to power in France would either bring back the Bourbon monarchy or at least create some government able to meet its agreements. And after all, Liverpool reasoned, and so did other people in Britain as well, the French needed peace. The French were exhausted, not just by war, but by revolution. Now, these points matter because the failure of peace, failure of the Peace of Amiens, convinced opinion across a very broad spectrum in Britain, but including King George III and William Pitt the Younger and Pitt's protégés who dominated British politics for the rest of the war, that there's no way you can deal with Napoleon. Napoleon negotiated in the spirit of what's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable. And
that was Lord Liverpool's view of Napoleon.
That was Liverpool's view. That came to be Liverpool's view.
Okay, yeah.
After dealing with Napoleon, actually, it's a point I owe to the historian Paul Schrader, because Napoleon acted the same way with Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and Napoleon's intransigence becomes a key factor in essentially aligning all of Europe's powers against him, because European states, and Britain was first in this path. British states, European states, the European great powers, and some of the smaller powers realized there was no way they could live with Napoleonic France except as a subordinate or satellite state. And so that led to a series of coalitions. And Britain was pivotal in the diplomatic organization of coalitions against France. Britain in the war played a key part by financing other countries. That the British never had an army the same size of France or of Prussia or Austria or Russia, but the British made up for it by giving their allies either outright grants or loans on very favorable terms to support their money, along with a smaller British army and, of course, the Royal Navy as a tool of war. So Britain always operated through coalition warfare, and the key challenge had been to build those coalitions, sustain them as far as possible, and I'm looking forward over the period after the Peace of Amiens, and then be ready if the coalition fell apart, if Napoleon won that round of the war, be ready to hold out against, to stand alone. And for a fair bit of the war, Britain did stand alone. And your question is, how did Liverpool direct the war? Well, a key part of that story is, as Secretary at War during the Peninsular War, he was Secretary at War from 1809 to 1812.
Help us at the Peninsular War. What was that specifically?
That's the war it's part of the Napoleonic Wars. It's the war in Spain and Portugal that breaks out when Napoleon takes over Spain and invades Portugal.
Okay.
Napoleon put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne, and that unleashed turmoil in the Iberian Peninsula. It becomes known as the Peninsular War. It also upset the balance within Spain, South American, and global empire. So this is this small, what seems like a small theater of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, has a global effect.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was going to say, to very quickly, Liverpool had provided the domestic support to keep Wellington's army in Portugal in the field, supplied and effective in resisting the French. And then working with Wellington to rebuild Portugal's army, to build a conventional Spanish army, or at least keep the Spanish able to resist other than the guerrilla war that was going on in Spain, and then be ready to counterattack, drive the French out of Portugal. And then work over the period after 1812 to drive the French out of Spain as well. It's notable that the first Allied troops to cross into in 1814 to cross into France were British troops coming from Spain. It wasn't the armies of Prussia, Austria, and Russia marching through Germany on their epic sweep, but rather it was Wellington's army from the peninsula.
I was thinking here, how would you compare Lord Liverpool with, I think a lot of our listeners are very familiar with Edmund Burke and the way Edmund Burke approached the French Revolution in particular. And also, I think both Edmund Burke and Lord Liverpool, I think, very similar in that they start from a baseline of defending the English constitutional order. But how did they each understand that?
Let me make a quick point as context and then answer your question directly. E.P. Thompson, the Marxist historian, wrote a famous, or at least well-known book called The Making of the English Working Class. And it covered really the period we're discussing in a slightly longer era. Well, this is also from really the 1760s, 1770s, right into the 1830s. It's also a period that sees the making of English conservatism. The term conservative gained political meaning really in the 1820s, and it was I think it was coined as a label for the Conservative Party in the early 1830s. I forget the specifics of this, but Liverpool and Burke are key figures in the development of a conservative idea. Burke was, of course, a Whig, an opposition Whig, who broke with his fellow Whigs and Charles James Fox over the French Revolution. And he and Liverpool shared a suspicion of France, a deep suspicion of the French Revolution. Liverpool was at Bastille. He saw the fall of the Bastille. He was in Paris during 1789. He was staying with a member of the French elite, an acquaintance of his father, to study French, the French language.
You said he was sent there by his father as his kind of last round of becoming a gentleman.
Yeah, it's
watches the undoing of
unfolding of revolution. And it's interesting. Liverpool gave a speech in 1819 on violence and riot, and in that speech in the House of Lords, he said, "Hey, I was there at the Bastille. I know what this is like to see order break down." And so Liverpool became deeply preoccupied with the fragility of order. And he saw, it's worth noting that the Bastille, yes, the fall of the Bastille is a violent incident. There are other violent incidents. What's interesting is that Liverpool was there to watch the whole system essentially fall apart. It's an unfolding of disorder, it's a pattern, it's a cycle. It's not just a single incident. And he was very concerned about that. He later returned on a grand tour through the Netherlands, France, and then Italy, and saw more of what had unfolded. Liverpool also read a lot, and he read several histories of the French wars of religion in the 16th century. And readers who are aware of the wars of religion, not just in France, but also in Germany, and indeed the English Civil Wars of the 1640s are in many ways a religious war, that this is a period of tremendous upheaval, and these were especially violent and disruptive wars. They were civil wars within the polity, within the political community. And so reading those stories, reading those accounts, particularly in France, that shaped how Liverpool saw or how Liverpool understood what he was seeing. And he understood the revolution, the French Revolution, in many ways. We would say an ideological crusade, but it was a lot like those bitter conflicts of religion that differed from other kinds of conflict.
Thinking about Lord Liverpool defending the English constitutional order.
Yeah.
We talk about the threat he saw from the French Revolution, and then the ongoing, expansion to bring those ideas throughout the continent. And so, but internal dynamics, and we've touched on that as well. His fear, I think, that consumed his career the breakdown of order, and it's a good concern to have. What are the internal dynamics in Britain that he sees threatening order?
Well, one of the things, Liverpool was the defender of the 18th century balanced constitution, and Burke admired the balanced constitution as well. In different speeches over his career, Liverpool.
What is that? When we say we're going to defend the balanced constitution,
balanced constitution.
What does that mean exactly?
The balanced constitution of king, lords, and commons, the estates of the realm, the community of the realm represented in Parliament, and to use the phrase "the estates of the realm," the nobility and the commons represented. That would have sounded even in the early 19th century somewhat old-fashioned. There's a broader conception of interest, which encompasses what we'd call economic interests and regional groups, regional interests within the British Isles. And the balanced constitution used parliamentary monarchy and a fairly open political culture, the absence of prior censorship of the press, a robust sphere of public debate, but also the Church of England by law established, which represented the faith of most of the people in England, certainly, and it guaranteed public orthodoxy in religion and supported the Constitution while providing freedom of worship and toleration for those who were not members of it. It kept order and it kept religious conflicts from an earlier period out of the public sphere, at least minimized them. That's the balanced constitution. And it's something that Burke supported as well. The challenge for Liverpool, the challenge that Liverpool saw from his early years in the 1790s through his premiership, is that there are a number of shocks that start hitting the balanced constitution pretty hard. Some of those shocks are economic. And the way in which the beginnings of industrial manufacturing and sharply fluctuating trade cycles that would throw people out of work, that created tremendous discontent among the poor and the near poor, what we would call the working classes. And this gets back to that E.B. Thompson idea of the making of a working class, whether they were workers on the land, farm laborers, or whether they were in factories and workshops. But when orders dried up and people were thrown out of work, there wasn't the safety net to support them was limited. And those fluctuations brought political instability, including at times violence. How do you channel those? It's a period where population in the British Isles had grown since the 18th century. One concern Liverpool had from his early years in the 1790s, food supply. When food is short or food is expensive, that leads to people going hungry or having a harder time meeting their needs by paying for food, and that leads to discontent, often violent protest. So that's part of it. And there are other ways, particularly after the Napoleonic Wars, where economic swings and the adjustment to peace, that imposed a scissors effect on the middle and some of the upper classes, the wealthier portions of the population who often faced fixed costs. If you were a factory owner or you were a landowner, particularly if you'd borrowed money to improve land, you have fixed costs, but then profits, particularly profits from the land, or where there was a trade slump, profits fall, and you're stuck. And that created discontent among the propertied classes and among the politically influential that led to conflict in Parliament.
So one view, and I think you're describing this, one view of this period is sort of the slow transformation from a military fiscal state to a laissez-faire state, which people credit Lord Liverpool, at least with managing fairly well. Maybe talk about how he dealt with these discontents, which you're describing, what he thought were better solutions.
Over the long 18th century, over the decades after 1688, what historians have called the Second Hundred Years' War between Britain and France, rivalry, had led Britain to develop a fiscal military state, a whole infrastructure of taxation, of borrowing, a national debt, with all sorts of government contracts and jobs in administrative jobs, tax collector jobs, and other things to run it. And the fiscal side of it was supporting a larger military effort. And that state grew over the 18th century. It became a point of contention when government jobs and government contracts and government pensions were used as patronage to bolster governments in power politically, to get them majorities in the House of Commons and other kinds of support. It grew exponentially with the Napoleonic War. But then after the war ended, it's not needed anymore. Britain had won unprecedented security. There's no more threat to justify this. But there is increasing complaint. And so Liverpool's project was to cut the state back as far as he could, a process described as economic reform, lowering military spending, paying off debt, abolishing government offices, and also abolishing pensions. And sometimes this involved actually buying people out, giving them a grant of money so that they would give up an office that they saw as kind of a personal property. The salary of that office was their property, which we don't understand it that way today. But what this allowed Liverpool to do was cut taxes, stabilize public finance, and above all, show that the government was responding to complaints about the size of government and the cost of government.
So you talk about as well that there's all sorts of discontents being created here because there is a huge debt overhang.
Yeah.
So he's got to maintain a certain level of taxation to support that. And that gets into, there's also the turn towards free trade, which you talk about as well. Maybe spend some time describing that and what he sees free trade offering Britain.
This is part of what this goes in parallel with the dismantling of the fiscal military state. And it ties into plebeian discontent, those who did not have the vote, but who would come out and protest as well. And I'll explain this in a second.
Now, in the book, you use the word plebeian frequently. Yeah. I was going to ask you, why do you use that word? That's interesting.
It's a word, plebeian. It's a word that would have been used at the time for the mass of the population. It's not a word. I think today perhaps it carries a connotation of disdain. But at the time and in the 19th century, at the 18th and 19th century, it would not have carried a connotation of disdain or dislike. It's what would be referred elsewhere as the popular classes, meaning the majority of the population, those who labor and work with their hands, some of whom would be tradesmen, skilled tradesmen, but who are not themselves owners of property. Their property is in themselves and in their labor. Okay. So that's a way to use that. And those people are not having property other than, as they say, property in themselves, their labor, their skills. They're more vulnerable to rapid changes and fluctuations. They can't go back to, they can't just rely on capital to tide them over, or saving, or much in the way of savings to tide them over. There's a little example that I just want to bring up briefly to explain that. There was a dispute over over the issue of banknotes rather than coin money, because banknotes are symbols of value, but coin has value in the precious metal and gold. And during a debate, I think it was in 1826, there was a discussion about, well, a poor man with a pound note, he can't wait until the value of that paper goes back up against the coin. He has to spend that money on his own. And so Liverpool made the remark that, that paper money that lures value, that's actually cheat on the poor who can't just hold on to the paper until the value recovers as a consequence of an economic fluctuation. So that's a small point. Yeah. But in terms of liberalizing trade, there are two sides to this. Dismantling the state, or dismantling the fiscal military state, that's part of it. The other part is to end restrictions, or at least cut back on restrictions involving trade. Over the 18th century, Britain pursued what are known as mercantilist policies, designed to regulate trade, overseas trade, to benefit Britain. The idea is that you want to have a trade surplus, and trade is a zero-sum game. If you don't have a surplus, then you are losing. And so you establish various rules to direct trade to your own advantage, and to control colonies, to limit what colonies can either manufacture or direct their trade to the metropole, in Britain's case, to the British Isles, so that colonies buy British goods and provide British products, and then colonial products traded with Europe or elsewhere outside the empire for an advantage. What Liverpool realized was that more trade means more profit. And liberalizing many of these rules would have two effects. One, it would increase the scale of trade, the volume of trade, and therefore make more profit. Liberalizing many of these rules would also lower the cost of goods. And that would encourage economic activity. It would also help raise living standards, particularly for those of limited incomes, and by lowering the cost of often very basic goods, and improving both the economy and living standards was a way to assuage discontent in that sense.
Did it succeed for Lord Liverpool?
Yes, it did. I mean, there's statistics. In fact, Liverpool cited statistics, and one could go back and look at them in much more detail, that in the 1820s, for two reasons. One was changing the rules to encourage trade, but also lowering taxes. Much of British revenue came from indirect taxes on consumption. So lowering those taxes cuts the cost of consumer goods. And one of the things about trade, I'd say quickly, is that lowering many of those taxes, particularly taxes on imported goods like imports like wine, that also lowered the smuggler's premium. So it cut illegal trade, and by cutting illegal trade, it meant you'd get more revenue from legal trade. So that was another part. Yeah. Imagine that. It was another part of the project. So what Liverpool was trying to do was essentially contract the state's role in the economy. The state's role, both borrowing and purchasing, and thereby create space for what we would call the private sector to expand and therefore generate more activity.
Thinking about, so isn't Lord Liverpool, though, also associated with the Corn Laws, which were protectionist measures?
Yes, he is.
So explain that contradiction. I'm sure he had something to say.
There's a contradiction there. The Corn Laws came out of England, especially the experience of England, not just the British Isles as a whole, but England. Food shortages in the 1790s. And also a key factor in the outbreak of the French Revolution and its early viciousness was food shortages in France and some, I don't want to say famine, but in some regions of France, there's severe hunger. And certainly there were episodes of severe hunger in Britain. Liverpool saw how that led to violence, and it certainly led to misery for the people who couldn't buy food at the available price. And the Corn Laws passed. The Corn Laws were an attempt in 1815 to ensure that Britain could produce enough grain at home to provide a secure supply. And the idea was that over the course of the wars, when imports had been restricted, that people had invested money, borrowed money to improve lands to produce more, and so that was an idea to make it economically viable to keep in grain farming in Britain. It proved to not work out as planned, and it became a point of discontent. And over the 1820s, Liverpool sought to reform the Corn Laws, lowering the duties and allowing a certain amount of imports. Strictly from economic theory, the Corn Laws look ridiculous, and it seems like a classic case of rent-seeking behavior. That wasn't the way people were thinking about it. It wasn't simply a gift to the quote-unquote landed interest of Britain. That the landed interest, by the way, pushed very, very hard to keep in the 1820s and right up until they were abolished. But it was an effort to make sure that that the country didn't run out of food. And rather than simply abolish them, what Liverpool, towards the end of his life and his premiership, looked to do was to modify them so you could make trade freer without entirely pulling the floor out from British grain farmers.
So, okay, I can understand that from I've read people like David Goldman and others argue, it's really bad that there's only one functioning military shipyard in the United States.
Yeah.
Maybe we need, there needs to be some sort of positive government action there for the sake of national security. And that's interesting defense of the Corn Laws. So I don't want to get all woke here, Will.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask you some controversial points in Lord Liverpool's tenure.
Yeah.
One, his stance on Catholic emancipation. Qualified ways he was against it. The slave trade, qualified ways he was against its immediate abolition. And then also the Peterloo Massacre. So maybe take those in turn, talk about how the question was presented and how Liverpool tried to answer them.
All right, let's take the worst one first, the slave trade. How could anybody make any case for the slave trade? Liverpool spoke in Parliament against abolishing the slave trade in the 1790s, and he sustained that position, not aggressively, but he sustained that position until the slave trade was abolished in Britain in 1807. And thereafter, it's worth noting, Liverpool pushed to extend abolition and to pressure other countries into abolishing the slave trade as well. What was Liverpool's reasoning? First thing to note, that Liverpool never argued the question in racial terms. So it's a very different discussion from what you find later in the 19th century in the United States and even in other countries. Liverpool's argument was in some ways prudential and practical, and it boiled down to this thing exists, and Britain is more likely to carry it on in a less inhumane way than other countries, Spain, Portugal, France. And if Britain gets out of it, then other countries will simply pick up the slack, and it won't change a thing for Britain. Liverpool was concerned about the property rights involved. Now, again, this sounds horrific, but even at the time, people accepted that there were property rights involved in slavery. And when Britain abolished slavery, the British state paid compensation to slave owners. So it's important not to see this in later terms, but to see it in terms of the time. And Liverpool recognized that he was on the wrong side of opinion at his own time. He was attentive to the pressures from the West India interest, from
the British commercial interest in the Caribbean.
Yes, British commercials in West India.
Okay.
And one thing that, and again, this is not a justification of it, but in explaining the mindset, Britain had lost the mainland American colonies in the 1790s. And in some circles of the British government, including Liverpool's father, Charles Jenkinson, antagonizing the Caribbean colonies by going too far by abolishing slavery, that feared another breakaway or feared generating another controversy, a backlash with them. So some within the government resisted that. Others, including Pitt, including Wilberforce, said we don't care, that there are other priorities in this case. And so Liverpool was very much on the wrong side of that issue. Catholic emancipation. Onto Catholic emancipation. Liverpool, interestingly enough, was long sympathetic to Roman Catholics and Roman Catholicism. And he did not at first oppose the idea of Catholic emancipation when it was proposed in the late 1790s. Liverpool himself had been a chairman of a charity to help French emigre Catholic priests who'd fled to England from the French Revolution. But Liverpool saw the problem, and Catholic emancipation was largely an issue in Ireland. I mean, it involved Catholics elsewhere in the British Isles, but the issue was at its sharpest in Ireland. And Liverpool saw the real problems in Ireland as being more tithes than the Catholic question. The requirement of Catholic peasants to pay a tithe to the established church, the Church of England, and Liverpool in the 1820s worked to commute many of those tithes in a way that wouldn't upset the Church of Ireland, but it also would relieve the Irish from the burden of paying those tithes. He saw the question as finding ways to meet Irish economic grievances, particularly plebeian Irish economic grievances. When George III rejected Catholic emancipation, Liverpool took up the king's position on that. And over time,
let me ask you, when you're saying Catholic emancipation, what did that term mean overall?
Yes. Catholics were not enslaved. A number of Catholics in England were quite privileged. There's a very good book by Antonia Fraser on the Catholic question. What Catholic emancipation meant was giving Roman Catholics in the British Isles full access to government offices, appointments, sitting in Parliament, sitting in the House of Lords, commissions in the Army and Navy. There had been a Test Act, and this is a legacy of the 17th century religious wars. There had been a Test Act limiting political power, essentially, or political office at least, to members of the Church of England by law established. So it's not just Catholics, but also nonconformist Protestants and a much smaller number of Jews who are excluded from holding office because they can't take the oaths. They cannot take oaths and take the sacrament of Holy Communion by the rights of the Church of England.
Okay.
And so the demand for Catholic emancipation in England.
So that would have been in many respects.
Yeah.
I mean, that would have been important to every Catholic in the British Isles, but of immediate concern to only a very few who might expect those offices or be thinking about them.
Yeah, even in Ireland, it was to a very few. The situation elsewhere, the situation in England was there were very few. Catholics were a small minority. They were largely an elite minority, and they had proven themselves, except in their religion, to be as English as everybody else. In Ireland, it's a different case, where the Catholics are a vast majority. Both property and political power are reserved to Protestants. There are a few Catholic landowners in Ireland, but not very many. And there are a few Catholic professionals in Ireland, but not very many. The leadership class, that the landed gentry, or that professionals, that merchants and manufacturers might provide elsewhere, in Ireland those were Catholic priests, because the Catholic clergy was closest to the Irish Catholic majority than the Protestant landowners, tradesmen, professionals were. And that's where the question was most acute. Liverpool came to see this as a political question, not as a religious question. He said if religion was the only issue, there would be no objection to giving Roman Catholics the same access to privileges as Protestants, as their Protestant fellow subjects. But, he said, Catholics who looked to the Pope in Rome offered only a divided allegiance rather than full allegiance to the crown and to the country. And so Liverpool resisted it. I think the tragedy on this question with Liverpool is he got so dug in and so committed to the position, and it had become a principle to him. And he was also very committed to upholding the Church of England as an institution. He supported the church and was actually a reformer and an improver of the Church of England during his political career. But if he and if others had much earlier, Catholic emancipation came in 1829, if he and others had earlier pushed for an accommodation with the Pope that would have allowed a managed form of Catholic emancipation, essentially giving clergy salaries and giving the British state some influence in appointments within the church, senior appointments within the church, and giving clergy some stake in good relations with the government. That would have worked a lot better. But unfortunately, that failed, and it's George III who rejected the proposal to include Catholic emancipation with the Irish Union. And once the king had made that statement, that dug people in, and it became harder to arrange and manage a kind of settlement, what they would call a concordat, with the Pope that would meet the needs of that would extend privilege to Roman Catholics and remove the impediments to entering public life.
So thinking here also, the Peterloo Massacre, talking about the working class here, but if I recall correctly, 15 people die during a mass protest, essentially, that British authorities cracked down very hard on.
Well, I'm leery of facile analogies and easy historical comparisons, but because usually A is not a lot like B. But Peterloo certainly was not like the Bastille or some other violent protests. If you want to understand what happened at Peterloo, there was a story in the early 1980s about a rock concert. I think the Who were playing, a band called the Who, were playing in Cleveland. And people got out of control, and the crowd panicked, and people were trampled. And there's a similar case in a soccer stadium in Britain. I think it might have been Hillsborough in the 80s or the 90s. And crowds take on a life of their own. What had happened I think it's worth understanding what was going on at Liverpool. Not at Liverpool, at Peterloo.
The Peterloo Massacre was what year?
It was 1819, and it was outside the city of Manchester. It was in St. Peter's Fields. A journalist called it Peterloo as an ironic twist on the great triumph at Waterloo. Instead of fighting the French, now troops were fighting their own fellow subjects. And Peterloo came at a point after months of radical agitation. There had been an economic slump in the spring summer of 1819, and another wave of radical protests. And radicals from the 1790s, people like Thomas Paine and later William Cobbett, argued that the only way to address economic grievances is with sweeping political reform that would end privilege, that would give plebeians, give ordinary people votes for Parliament, a say in Parliament, abolish the privileges of the church, cut out pensions, and cut back on the expenses of what was seen as a profligate court. And this became a very powerful argument during periods of discontent. And there have been a series of meetings before Peterloo where crowds, organized groups met to hear speakers arguing for reform. Many of these groups would march in with a band instead of just showing up to an event the way one might show up to any event, including a political rally today or a political meeting then. Groups would show up. They would be marching in formation with a band. And there were cases where groups showed that they had drilled, that they'd practiced marching just like soldiers did. Instead of firing muskets, they could clap on demand. And this was kind of an intimidating thing because you had former veterans who were now training men to march and do drill. Well, it starts to look a little intimidating to the state and to local magistrates. What happened at Peterloo what led to Peterloo in St. Peter's Fields? It's important to note that Britain did not have a police force at the time. There was no national police. There really wasn't much in the way of local police. If there was unrest, a riot act dating from, I think, 1711 allowed a magistrate to go out and demand that the crowd disperse, to read the terms of the Riot Act, as it was known. That's where the phrase "read the Riot Act" comes from. To read the terms and demand the crowd to disperse. And if they didn't disperse within a reasonable amount of time, they would be committing a felony at law. And magistrates had the authority to request support from soldiers. The army had been the ultimate arm of state authority. I mean, there were small groups of watchmen and so forth to handle crime and other things. But for the most part, it was on a larger scale, it was the army that would be called out. Regular soldiers, or at least volunteer soldiers. And at Manchester, the magistrates, fearing some incident, fearing that the meeting might elect a legislative attorney. Another meeting had elected a man to be their legislative attorney, which was a defiance of the law, because no community could elect a member to Parliament without the King's writ. There was an implicit challenge, not to the authority of the King, but the authority of Parliament in some of these meetings. And so the Manchester magistrates denied a permit. They said, "You can't meet. Break up and go home." And one of the magistrates went out to read the Riot Act. There were yeomanry or volunteer cavalry who were not as well trained as regulars, particularly as veteran regulars. And a large crowd, you don't have amplified speaking, you don't have ways to reach everybody. You think about a big crowd, and if you didn't have loudspeakers and the kind of technology we use today, how do people in the back hear? How do you get the word through? And how do you know that somebody has read the Riot Act? So this is a big crowd, and women and children there as well. When soldiers tried to disperse them after the Riot Act had been read, people panicked, people ran around, soldiers pushed them more, and that led to people being crushed and trampled, and that produced the deaths. It was not a case where soldiers, sabers drawn, rode down, swinging swords and axes to butcher the innocent. It was a failed crowd control by panicked magistrates. And the government was in a difficult position because local government was fairly autonomous at the time.
You noted in the book, you noted in the book when there's this pushback, 15 people die, I assume scores more injured, and there's this pushback. But the government, Liverpool's government, thinks, well, they must still defend, though, the actions of local government officials. Otherwise, in the future, would there be any crowd control issue?
Yes.
But that of course sparked. Well, if you think there's going to be more of these incidents, that sparks all sorts of questions as well. Like, what are you not getting right? I think maybe. Yeah. The fear was among the establishment that if you don't support the magistrates, then nobody would act. People would fear that they would be left hanging out to dry, and to be honest, they would be liable to prosecution. Soldiers over the 18th century into the early 19th century, there are cases where troops acting beyond the authority granted them by magistrates had been charged with crimes at common law. And if you're fearing being tried, possibly for your life, you're not going to be very assertive, and that could lead to other kinds of failure. So supporting the magistrates was a very bad PR move, and it aroused a lot of opposition. What followed Peterloo was debates in Parliament and a series of measures that became known as the Six Acts that were passed at the end of 1819. And the Six Acts were designed to not suspend English liberties, because as part of the balanced constitution, Liverpool was very committed to popular liberties and things like habeas corpus and the rule of law. But these were efforts to contain the size of meetings, restrictions on meetings by people from outside the area. There were also restrictions on training men and gathering arms, not trying to prevent people from meeting or discussing, but as Liverpool said, keeping meetings on the same scale they were 20 years ago, and
to minimize the danger of an incident like Peterloo. And that those measures have been presented retrospectively as repressive and harsh, but they were not as outside of the norm, and this wasn't a period of crushing English liberties. One other thing was restrictions on the press, and Britain had no prior censorship. People could be charged with seditious libel or blasphemous libel if they published something offensive, an attack on the government. But the problem with that was that you had to take the case to a jury. And it could be much, much more embarrassing to lose a case charged with blasphemous libel. In fact, there are a couple of incidents of that happening. And so the government became much more cautious in taking cases to trial where the jury might throw it out. And then it would be reported in the press, and it would make the government look foolish and embarrass them. So, the British government had to.
Let me ask you maybe real quickly here at the end. You're one of the few biographers who've paid close attention to Lord Liverpool. Maybe sum up why you think he's been overlooked, and just sum up his career for us. What he means.
There are a couple of reasons why he's been overlooked, and some of them are personal, and some of them much bigger and structural. And let me talk about the personal first.
Well, let's move quickly here at the end. And just
very quickly, absolutely.
Yeah.
Lord Liverpool was a man who was not charismatic. He was not a domineering figure. He was very collegial in the way he operated. He shared credit with his colleagues. So he was not seen as a driving force. He's been presented as more the chairman of the committee than the mover of public policy. So that's one issue. The other factor, the structural factor, is that after Liverpool died in 1828, there are a series of changes that transform politics in Britain. The 1832 Reform Act transformed parliamentary representation, and there are other changes. There's a Whig liberal domination of British government from 1830 to 1886. During this period, the people who were upholding the changes and defending the changes had a big stake in presenting the old world as a bad world. We have brought reform. We have brought change. They, particularly Lord Liverpool, held it all back. And so Liverpool was forgotten, was marginalized, and was often disparaged as a reactionary. These were the black years of reaction after the Battle of Waterloo, and only later could liberal England flourish, or liberal Britain flourish. And that stuck. Liverpool's actually a figure who laid a foundation for laissez-faire in 19th century Britain and beyond. He's a figure who set out, as the historian Norman Gash puts it, a lasting line of conservative policy that people like Robert Peel, and in some ways even William Gladstone, the liberal, followed later in the 19th century. So he's the figure who got Britain through a turbulent era, even though he didn't take much credit himself, even though he seemed like a personally retiring figure. He was the keystone in the political architecture that carried Britain through this birth of the modern, through this very turbulent era, into a more stable period of mid-Victorian and Victorian prosperity. So I think that's a lot of the takeaway of Liverpool's life and career. He resisted revolution and brought about reform and channeled change to keep it from being disruptive.
Well, hey, thank you so much. We've been talking with the author of Lord Liverpool, A Political Biography.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.